Pretend I was busy, Mom told him with a wink before she left. He didn't pretend. The bruise blooming under my sleeve that night wasn't from an accident. It was from the man she married. What neither of them knew was that the doorbell camera was recording, its sensitive microphone picking up every suppressed sound from inside the house. They thought their control was absolute, but this time, I wasn't deleting the footage. This time, it was evidence. My name is Caroline Miller. I am 33 years old, an age where life should be a narrative you write for yourself. Mine is a story I'm forced to inhabit. A quiet two-story house in the suffocatingly peaceful suburbs of Waverly, Ohio, from the outside. It's a picture of middle American success, a manicured lawn, an oak tree that shades the porch just so, and a fresh coat of eggshell paint on the siding. Inside, the air is thick with the unspoken, the house held together not by love or familial bonds, but by a brittle framework of denial. I live here with my mother, Eleanor, and the man she married, Robert Hale. My mother has a mantra, a little prayer she whispers to me whenever Robert's presence becomes too heavy in a room, whenever his words leave a welt on my spirit. Just endure it a little. Caroline, she'll say, her eyes refusing to meet mine, focusing instead on a dust mote in a sunbeam or a loose thread on the sofa. He provides for both of us. She says the word provides as if it's a sacred absolution, a blanket that covers all sins. It pays for the mortgage on this silent house. It pays for the groceries in the immaculate refrigerator and the gasoline in her car. It pays for the illusion of stability she lost when my real father walked out and never looked back. To her, what Robert provides is a barricade against the world's uncertainties, and my peace of mind is a small, acceptable tax to pay for its upkeep. I used to think she was just weak, but I've come to understand it's a conscious transaction. She has sold my comfort for her security, and she renews the lease every single day. Robert Hale is a man of two distinct voices. In public, at neighborhood barbecues or company dinners, he is the picture of benign patriarchy. He uses his deep, resonant voice to tell harmless jokes, to discuss market trends with an air of authority, and to call my mother honey in a way that makes other women sigh with admiration. He has a firm handshake for the men and a paternalistic, condescending smile for me, his daughter, the quiet, serious girl who works in accounting. He performs the role of the steadfast provider, the man who stepped in and saved two helpless women. But when my mother's car pulls out of the driveway, that man vanishes. The air in the house changes. The pressure drops. His footsteps on the hardwood floors become heavier, more deliberate, each one a declaration of ownership. The resonant voice flattens into something guttural and low, a menacing hum that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. His requests become commands. Get me a beer. Replaces, could you grab me a beer? Honey. The space he occupies seems to expand until it fills every room, every hallway, pushing me into the corners. He is a master of the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible slide from civility to contempt. It's in the way his eyes linger on me a second too long, the way he leaves a door open when I'm changing, the way he forgets my name and just calls me you. It's a slow, methodical erosion of my personhood, and he does it all without raising his voice, because the threat is in the quiet. The quiet is where he lives. That night began like so many others, with the oppressive tension of a coming storm. My mother was getting ready for a monthly book club meeting, which was really just an excuse for her and her friends to drink too much Chardonnay and complain about their husbands. The air was thick with her hairspray and perfume, a cloying floral scent that did little to mask the underlying odor of anxiety. She stood at the doorway of the kitchen, resplendent in a silk blouse that was a bit too tight, her face a carefully constructed mask of makeup. Robert was leaning against the counter, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching me chop vegetables for a solitary dinner. She looked from him to me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Then she smiled, a bright, brittle thing. She turned to Robert, and the gesture that followed shattered the last vestiges of my hope that she was on my side, that she was merely a victim of circumstance. She winked at him, It was a small, conspiratorial gesture, a signal passing between allies. "Pretend she's busy," she said, her voice light and teasing. Then she turned, her heels clicking on the tile, and walked out the front door, leaving me in the echo of her permission. "Pretend she's busy," the words hung in the air, a death sentence for the evening's peace. She hadn't said, "Don't bother Caroline." She hadn't said, "Let her have a quiet night." She had made me the object of a game, a thing to be managed. She had handed him the reins and told him to ride. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the rhythmic tap of my knife against the cutting board and the clink of ice in Robert's glass. I focused on the precise, even slices of carrot, on the sharp, clean scent of the onion. If I could just concentrate on the task, maybe he would lose interest. Maybe the silence would be enough. It never is. I felt his presence behind me before I heard him, the warmth of his body, the sour smell of whiskey on his breath. The fine hairs on my arms stood up. I kept chopping, my knuckles white on the handle of the knife. "Busy." "Huh." His voice was a low rasp. Right next to my ear. It was the other voice, the one meant only for me. "Let's see." His hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist, the one holding the knife. His grip was like iron. He squeezed, and I instinctively opened my hand, the knife clattering onto the counter. The other hand came up, not in a fist, but open-palmed. The motion was surprisingly fast, a blur in my peripheral vision. The sound was a sharp, flat crack that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My head snapped to the side, my cheek exploding with a white-hot, stinging fire. The force of it sent me stumbling sideways, off balance. I crashed against the stove, my hip hitting the sharp corner of the oven door. A pot of simmering water I'd set for pasta tilted, wobbled, and then crashed to the floor, sending a wave of scalding water and steam across the linoleum. The metallic clang of the pot was deafening, a punctuation mark on his violence. I lay there for a moment, half on the floor, my cheek screaming, my hip throbbing, the smell of burnt garlic and spilled water filling my nostrils. A wave of nausea washed over me. The first, instinctual impulse was to sob, a raw, primal sound of pain and shock. But as the tears welled, a cold, hard thought pierced through the haze. He would like that. The sight of my tears would be a victory, a confirmation of his power. Crying would feed the monstrous thing inside him. So I held my breath. I bit down on my lower lip until I tasted blood, focusing all my energy, all my will, on the simple act of not making a sound. I stared at the spilt water slowly spreading across the grout lines, the steam rising in lazy curls. I would not give him the satisfaction. The silence in the kitchen stretched, thick and heavy. I could hear his labored breathing, could feel his eyes on me. I refused to look up. I refused to cry. I made myself a stone. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I heard his heavy footsteps retreat. Then the sound of the living room television clicking on, loud and obnoxious. He was done. For now. I waited until I was sure he was settled before I slowly, painfully, pulled myself to my feet. I cleaned up the spilled water in the pot. I ran cold water over my wrist where the imprint of his fingers was already starting to darken. In the dim light of the bathroom mirror, I examined my face. A livid red handprint was beginning to bloom across my cheek, the skin already puffing up. It was ugly. It was proof. When my mother came home 2 hours later, she was flushed and smiling, humming a tune from the radio. She walked into the kitchen, where I was sitting at the table, staring at a blank wall, a bag of frozen peas held to my face. Her humming stopped. I watched as her eyes took in the scene me, the ice pack, the faint red mark that was now turning a mottled purple. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I saw it a flash of recognition, of guilt, maybe even fear. It was there and then it was gone, replaced by a mask of practiced indifference. She put her purse on the counter, avoiding my gaze. "Goodness, Caroline," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Did you drop something?" The question was a masterpiece of denial. It was an offer, A pre-written script for us both to follow. Yes, Mom. I dropped a can of tomatoes. So clumsy of me. It absolved her of any responsibility. It erased Robert's actions. It made me a clumsy girl, not a victim of the man she chose. I looked at her, really looked at her, and said nothing. I let the silence hang between us, heavy with the truth she was so desperate to avoid. I understood then, with a clarity that was as painful as the blow to my face. She knew, of course, she knew. She had always known. Every time he'd made a joke at my expense, every time I flinched when he entered a room, every time a dish was accidentally broken, she knew. She simply chose not to. Her comfort was built on a foundation of my fear, and she was a diligent gatekeeper of her own blissful ignorance. She was not his victim. She was his collaborator. That night, lying in my bed, the throbbing in my cheek a dull, constant rhythm, the cold anger that had been simmering for years finally hardened into something solid and sharp. The fear was gone, burned away by the acid of betrayal. There would be no more enduring, no more silent suffering in the hopes that things might change. They would not change. They would only get worse. I didn't reach for the phone to call a friend or a hotline. My pain was not a thing to be shared or soothed. It was a thing to be used. I slipped out of bed, crept to my desk, and took out my smartphone. I opened the simple, pre-installed voice recording app. I didn't know what I would capture. Maybe just the sound of his heavy footsteps in the hall, or the way his voice changed when he spoke to me. It didn't matter. I wasn't collecting evidence to beg for help or sympathy. I was forging a weapon. The age of pretending was over. I was starting to record, and I was preparing for war. This house is built on a foundation of lies, each one a carefully laid brick in the facade of a happy family. The most prominent lie is framed and sits on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It's a photograph from 3 years ago, taken on a family vacation to Myrtle Beach. In it, my mother is laughing, her head thrown back, her hand resting on Robert's arm. Robert is smiling a wide, toothy grin, one arm around my mother, the other draped heavily over my shoulder. And me, I'm smiling too. It's a perfect, practiced smile, one I was taught to produce on command. My eyes, however, are empty. They betray the truth. We are not a family. We are 3 strangers bound together by a contract of convenience and fear, performing for an audience that doesn't exist. The photograph isn't a memory. It's a piece of propaganda. The original fracture happened when I was 10. My father, a man I remember now only in hazy, sun-drenched fragments, packed a single suitcase and left. There was no dramatic fight, no shouting match for the neighbors to gossip about. There was only a profound and sudden quiet. He drove away in his Ford sedan and simply never came back. My mother explained it to me in hushed, clinical tones, as if she were reading a diagnosis. He needed something different, she'd said. For years, that quiet was our closest companion. We moved into a small, cramped apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear our neighbors' arguments and their reconciliations. We ate pasta with butter for dinner 3 nights a week. My mother worked 2 jobs, her hands raw and chapped, a permanent exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. She never cried in front of me, but sometimes, late at night, I would hear a muffled, rhythmic sobbing from her bedroom. She wasn't mourning my father. She was mourning the life she'd lost, the security that had vanished with him. She was terrified, and her terror became the wallpaper of my childhood. Then, when I was 16, Robert Hale appeared. He strode into our lives like a character from a movie, a savior in a tailored suit. He was a regional manager for a logistics company, a man who spoke of portfolios and 5-year plans. He met my mother at a dreary singles mixer she'd forced herself to attend. He bought her a proper drink instead of the cheap house wine. He listened to her. A week later, he took us both out to dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths. He didn't talk down to me. He asked about my grades and my plans for college, nodding thoughtfully as if my teenage ambitions were of great importance. He was charming. He was stable. He was everything my father wasn't. Within 6 months, He bought this house in Waverly. He filled it with new furniture. He gave my mother a credit card and told her to buy herself something nice. He promised her stability, a life where she would never again have to worry about the rent or the price of gasoline. My mother bloomed under his attention. The exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by a kind of desperate gratitude. She saw him not as a man, but as a deliverance. He was her escape from the quiet apartment and the buttery pasta, and she clung to him with the ferocity of a drowning woman. And that was when my real education began. It had nothing to do with school. My mother became my tutor in the art of pretense. "Stand up straight when Robert's clients are here. Caroline," she would instruct in a low whisper. "Don't talk about politics. It agitates him." Her most important lesson was on how to be photographed. If Robert pulled out a camera, my role was to become a prop in his tableau of domestic bliss. "Smile bigger." She'd hiss through her own plastered-on grin. "Look like you're happy to be here. We need to keep up appearances. We have to protect his image." It was never about protecting me. It was about protecting him. Protecting the life he provided. Protecting the deal she had made. I learned to smile. I learned to laugh at his jokes. I learned how to arrange my face into a mask of placid contentment. I learned how to keep the peace, which was a euphemism for erasing myself to make room for his ego. But the performance always had a curtain call. The moment the front door clicked shut behind the last guest, the moment the camera was put away, the set was struck. The lights of our happy home would dim. The man who had been telling jovial stories 5 minutes earlier would retreat into a sullen, brooding silence. The air would grow thick and heavy with the things he wasn't saying. The only sounds would be the clink of ice as he poured himself another whiskey and his heavy, discontented breathing as he sank into his leather armchair. In those moments, the house would feel like a tomb. My mother would busy herself in the kitchen, her movements quick and nervous, as if constant motion could ward off the encroaching darkness, and I would disappear. I learned the cartography of survival in this house. I knew which floorboards creaked and which stairs to skip. I learned how to move from one room to another with the silence of a cat. I learned to speak in quiet, non-committal tones, to offer no opinions, to ask for nothing. Most importantly, I learned not to make eye contact. Looking directly at him when he was in one of his moods was like staring into the sun. It was a challenge he couldn't abide. So I perfected the art of looking at a spot just over his shoulder, of focusing on the wall behind him, of making my gaze as vacant and unthreatening as possible. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the hallways of the house he paid for. My only real escape was my job, 5 days a week. I drive 30 minutes to the offices of Harper & Sloan Accounting. I step out of my car and into a different world, a different version of myself. In the clean, quiet, air-conditioned world of numbers, I am not a ghost. I am Caroline Miller, a senior internal auditor. I am precise. I am respected. I am in control. My world there is one of spreadsheets and balance sheets, of regulations and protocols. It is a world governed by logic, not by the volatile whims of a bitter man. The people I work with see me as quiet, competent, and intensely focused. They have no idea that the woman who calmly dissects multi-million-dollar corporate accounts spends her evenings trying to make herself invisible. My cubicle, with its neat stacks of files and its ergonomic chair, is more of a home to me than my own bedroom. It is my sanctuary, the one place where I am not pretending. For years, I told myself a lie that was almost as corrosive as the ones my mother told. I told myself that if I was just quiet enough, if I endured enough, if I faded into the background completely, things would get better. I thought my silence was a form of patience, a strategy. I believed that one day, he would soften, or my mother would wake up and see the prison she had built for us both. I was wrong. My silence wasn't a strategy. It was an anesthetic. It numbed me, but it didn't heal the wound, and it did nothing to change them. In fact, it did the opposite. My silence wasn't peace. It was permission. It was a vacuum that his anger and her denial rushed in to fill. It didn't make them weaker. It made them bolder. My quiet endurance wasn't earning me a future reprieve. It was cementing my role in their toxic play. It was ensuring that the performance would go on, indefinitely. And then, one evening a few months ago, a new character entered the narrative. It wasn't a person. It was a piece of technology. Robert, in a fit of paranoia about neighborhood crime, had a Nest doorbell camera installed. He loved it. He could sit in his armchair and see who was at the door, who was walking down the street, who was getting a package delivered. It was another tool of control, another way for the patriarch to monitor his domain. He didn't know, and I didn't tell him, that I went into the app settings on my own phone and enabled the 24/7 audio recording feature. He thought he had installed a pair of eyes to watch the outside world. He had no idea he had also installed an ear, a silent, impartial witness, just inside the front door, perfectly positioned to hear the hushed whispers and the ugly truths of the house of pretending. It was listening to everything. The Nest doorbell was Robert's proudest new acquisition, a small, sleek Cyclops eye mounted next to the front door. He installed it himself, a project that took an entire Saturday and involved a great deal of cursing. But he emerged from the task triumphant. Security, he announced at dinner that night, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the house. You can't be too careful these days. To him, it was a fortress gatekeeper, a way to screen visitors and monitor package deliveries. He loved the little chime it sent to his phone when it detected motion, a notification that reaffirmed his control over this small patch of Waverly, Ohio. He saw it as a shield facing outward, protecting his domain from the world. He never once considered that its most important function would be to look inward. I knew its capabilities better than he did. I had read the manual online. While he was focused on the video feed, I was interested in the microphone. It was designed to be sensitive, to pick up a visitor's voice clearly from several feet away. I knew that the acoustics of our front entryway, with its hardwood floors and high ceiling, would act as a natural amplifier. Sounds from the living room and the bottom of the staircase would travel, echoing slightly before being captured by the device. One night, after they were both asleep, I logged into the Nest app on my phone, navigated through the settings, and toggled on the 24/7 audio recording feature. It was a simple, silent tap of a finger on a screen, an act that felt both small and monumental. I didn't have a specific plan. It was more of an instinct, the same instinct that makes a cornered animal bare its teeth. I was simply beginning to document the reality of this house, creating a record that couldn't be denied or explained away. The camera was his tool of control, but the microphone was about to become my instrument of truth. The night it happened was a Thursday. Robert had come home from work in a foul mood, the kind that settled over the house like a low-pressure system, making the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. He'd lost a contract at work, and the injustice of it all was, in his mind, a personal affront that the world, and by extension, the two of us, was obligated to absorb. He drank whiskey for 2 hours, then switched to beer, cracking open each bottle with a sharp, aggressive hiss of carbonation. My mother, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, had made herself scarce, retreating upstairs with a headache. That left me downstairs, trapped in the orbit of his simmering rage. I was trying to be invisible, reading a book in the living room, keeping my breathing even and my movements minimal. He was pacing between the kitchen and the living room, a restless predator in his cage. He brushed past my chair, a bottle of beer in his hand, and as he did, he stumbled slightly. A small amount of amber liquid sloshed over the side of the bottle and onto the polished hardwood floor. It was a tiny puddle, no bigger than a coin. For a normal person, it would have been nothing, an annoyance. For Robert, it was the ignition point. He stopped dead, staring down at the floor as if it were a mortal wound. "Look what you made me do," he snarled, his voice a low growl. The accusation was so absurd, so nonsensical, that for a second I thought I'd misheard him. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "You're always just sitting there," he spat, turning to face me. His eyes were bloodshot and narrowed. "Just sitting and watching. You distracted me." He advanced on me, and I shrank back into the chair. He pointed a thick finger at the puddle. "Clean it up." It wasn't a request. I got up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady, and went to the kitchen to get a paper towel. As I walked back, my mind was racing. Don't engage. Don't argue. Just do it, and it will be over. I knelt down and wiped up the small spill. As I started to stand up, his foot shot out and kicked the paper towel from my hand. "You think that's good enough," he roared, his voice suddenly volcanic. "You left a sticky mess. You do everything halfway. You useless bitch." The words hit me harder than a slap. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. His grip was bruisingly tight. "I provide everything for you, and this is the respect I get." "Please, Robert, let go," I begged, my voice cracking. We were in the entryway now, directly in the line of sight and sound of the doorbell. The thought flashed through my mind, a tiny cold spark in the chaos. It can hear this. He shoved me backward. I stumbled, crashing into the small console table we kept by the door. A ceramic vase filled with my mother's fake hydrangeas teetered and then fell, shattering on the floor with a percussive crash that echoed through the house. The sound of the breaking vase seemed to unhinge him completely. He was no longer just angry. He was primal. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat as he advanced on me again. I scrambled away, trying to put the broken shards of the vase between us. "Please stop," I cried. The words half sob, half plea. "I'm sorry." He wasn't listening. He saw the broken pieces on the floor, another thing of his that was now ruined. He didn't come toward me. Instead, he turned and punched the wall. The sound was a dull, sickening thud, the sound of knuckles meeting drywall. He screamed again, a wordless bellow of pure rage. He stood there for a moment, breathing in ragged, heavy gasps, his fist still pressed against the dent he'd made in the wall. Then he turned his head and looked at me, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold fire. He took a step closer, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. The smell of beer and rage was overwhelming. "You will tell no one about this," he whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "Not your mother, not your friends, no one. If you tell anyone, I will ruin you. Do you understand me? I will make sure you lose your job, your reputation, everything. I will tell them you're crazy. I will tell them you attacked me. I will burn your entire life to the ground." I could only nod, tears streaming down my face, my entire body trembling. He held my gaze for another long, terrifying second, then straightened up, turned, and stalked up the stairs, leaving me alone with the wreckage. The next morning, the house was silent and filled with a bright, cheerful sunlight that felt like a mockery. I had crept out of my room at dawn, my body a symphony of aches, and documented the scene with my phone's camera, the shattered vase, the dent in the wall. Then I carefully cleaned up every last shard of ceramic. When I was done, you would never have known anything had happened. An hour later, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. I walked into the kitchen to find Robert at the stove, flipping pancakes. He was wearing a polo shirt and a smile. He looked rested, calm, the picture of domestic tranquility. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, his voice the easy, resonant baritone he used in public. "Pancakes are almost ready." My mother was at the table, sipping coffee, laughing at something he'd said. She looked at me, her eyes scanning my face, and for a fraction of a second, her smile tightened. She had heard, of course. She had heard the crash, the screaming. She had simply chosen to lock her door and wait for the storm to pass. I sat down, my stomach churning. I watched them interact, laughing and talking about their plans for the weekend. It was a flawless performance, a masterclass in denial. He was the benevolent patriarch, and she was his happy, contented wife. I was the audience. Later that day, when Robert was out golfing, I locked myself in my room. With trembling hands, I logged into the Nest app. There it was, a video file from the previous night, labeled Motion Detected. I put on my headphones and clicked play. The video showed nothing but the empty entryway, but the audio, The audio was everything. It was all there. My terrified pleading, the sickening crash of the vase, his unhinged, animalistic screams, the dull thud of his fist hitting the wall, and then his voice, chillingly clear and steady, the whispered threat, "If you tell anyone, I will ruin you." I listened to it 3 times. Then, I downloaded the file. It took several minutes, the progress bar on the screen moving with agonizing slowness. I saved the MP3 to a small, discreet USB flash drive, the kind that's no bigger than a thumbnail. The file was a weapon, and a weapon needs to be hidden until it's time to be used. I went to the kitchen, opened the pantry, and found the large ceramic canister labeled flour. I unscrewed the lid, pushed the tiny USB drive deep into the soft, white powder until it was completely submerged, and then screwed the lid back on. It was safe. That evening, my mother found me in my room. She closed the door behind her. "Your face is bruised, Caroline," she said, her voice low. She wouldn't look at the bruise directly, instead focusing on my earlobe. I said nothing. "I heard a crash last night," she continued, twisting the ring on her finger. "Robert said you dropped the vase." "He's lying," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. She finally looked at me, her eyes pleading, and that's when she delivered the line I knew was coming, the mantra of her survival. "Caroline, please, don't make a scene. If you make this a big deal, I could lose everything. This house, our life. He'll leave us." I looked at my mother, at the woman who had chosen comfort over her own child, security over my safety. The pity I once felt for her had evaporated, leaving behind something cold and hard. "You're not losing it." "Mom," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding, "you're choosing it." She flinched as if I'd struck her. She had no response. She just turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. I sat there in the silence, my hand unconsciously touching my bruised cheek. The recording was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was the centerpiece of a strategy. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the next day or the next week. I was thinking about the long game. The fear and the pain were still there, but now they were accompanied by something new, a cold, clear, an absolute sense of purpose. A plan was beginning to form in the quiet corners of my mind. A plan built not on screams or tears, but on the undeniable, recorded truth. My escape has a name, Harper & Sloan Accounting. It's located on the 7th floor of a nondescript glass and steel building downtown, a world away from the suffocating silence of Waverly. The moment I step out of the elevator, I feel a physical change. The air here is different, cool, filtered, smelling faintly of industrial-grade coffee and the clean, dry scent of paper. The world of Harper & Sloan is a universe of straight lines and right angles, of muted gray carpets and frosted glass partitions. It is a kingdom of logic, governed by the immutable laws of generally accepted accounting principles. Here, every number has its place, every transaction can be traced, and every discrepancy must be resolved. It is a place where facts matter, where truth is not a matter of opinion or convenience, but a quantifiable, verifiable reality. This office, this cubicle, this career, it is not just my job, it is my sanctuary. It is the one place I am not required to pretend. My manager is Dana Cooper, a sharp, pragmatic woman in her late 40s with a haircut so precise it looks like it was done with a laser. She moves through the office with an air of quiet, efficient authority. Dana is not a sentimental person. She values competence above all else. For months, she had observed me, her gaze analytical. She saw a quiet, intensely focused employee who consistently delivered meticulous work ahead of schedule. She mistook my trauma-induced hypervigilance for professional diligence. She saw a woman who never engaged in office gossip and who ate lunch at her desk, and she interpreted it as dedication. She didn't see the ghost from the house of pretending. She saw an ideal auditor. One Monday morning, she called me into her glass-walled office. "Miller," she began, getting straight to the point, "I'm taking you off the quarterly review for Apex Industries. I'm giving you the lead on the new Northgate logistics audit. I felt a jolt, a mixture of panic and exhilaration. Northgate was a major new client, a multi-million-dollar account. Leading the audit was a significant step up. Their internal controls are a mess, she continued, pushing a thick binder across her desk. It's going to require a deep dive. I need someone who won't be distracted, someone who can see the patterns in the noise. That's you. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Don't make me regret this. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of expectation. Walking out of her office with that binder in my arms, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. It wasn't the brutal, loud power that Robert wielded. It was the quiet, invisible power of competence and control. I poured myself into the Northgate audit. It became more than a job. It was the construction of a fortress. The rows and columns of the spreadsheets were my bricks. The dense, jargon-filled pages of financial regulations were my mortar. My desk was my command center, a bulwark against the chaos that awaited me at home. I would spend 10 hours a day tracing the flow of capital, identifying weaknesses in payment authorization processes, and documenting procedural flaws. There was a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction in it. At home, I had no control. A spilled drink could trigger an earthquake, but here, I was the one who imposed order. I could follow a single dollar from a purchase order through to its final ledger entry, and if it was out of place, I could find it. The world of numbers was clean, honest, and absolute. It was a shield, and I held it up with both hands. The long hours, however, did not go unnoticed. My work, my one source of strength, became another point of contention in Robert's world. He seethed at my growing independence. One evening, I came home close to 10 o'clock, exhausted but satisfied after having finally untangled a particularly snarled accounts payable issue. He was waiting for me in the living room, sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering television screen. The smell of whiskey was a heavy blanket in the air. "Must be nice," he slurred as I walked in, not even bothering to look at me. "Playing boss lady in your fancy office?" I didn't reply, heading for the stairs. "Don't you walk away from me," he growled. I froze, my hand on the newel post. "You think you're better than me now, don't you, with your little job and your little spreadsheets?" He stood up, his large frame a menacing silhouette against the blue light of the TV. "You think that makes you smarter than me?" "No, Robert," I said, my voice the carefully modulated, submissive tone I was forced to use at home. "I was just working late. The project is demanding." "The project is demanding," he mimicked in a high, mocking voice. He took a step closer. "I demand things too. I demand respect in my own home. But you're too busy. Aren't you too important?" He was inches from me now. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I kept my eyes down, focused on the pattern of the rug. Inside, I was calculating. I was the woman who had, just that afternoon, calmly explained to the CFO of Northgate Logistics that his company had a systemic vulnerability that put $7 million at risk. I was the professional he had listened to with deference, and here I was a child, being scolded for existing too loudly. The duality was a chasm, and I was living on both sides of it. The incident that changed everything happened the following week. It was a small, stupid mistake. I needed to print a form for a personal medical appointment, and I didn't want to use the printer at home. I had the form saved on a generic flash drive. I also, in a moment of paranoid impulse that I couldn't explain, had decided to bring the USB from the flour canister with me, tucked into a small, zippered pocket of my purse. I thought, vaguely, that it was safer with me than it was in the house. I walked to the communal print station at the end of the hall. A few colleagues were there, making small talk about the weekend. I smiled noncommittally, my mind still on a discrepancy in Northgate's inventory records. I reached into my purse, my fingers searching for the flash drive with my medical form. I pulled one out. It was small and black. Without looking closely, I moved to plug it into the USB port on the side of the massive, networked, multifunction printer. My fingers were a millimeter from the port when I stopped. A cold dread, sudden and absolute, washed over me. I glanced down at the object in my hand. It was the tiny, thumbnail-sized drive, the one from the flower, the one containing the audio file named Doorbell Footage Project Audit, MP3. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. The printer was connected to the entire company network. Plugging in an unapproved device would have, at minimum, triggered an alert with the IT department. They would have scanned the drive. They would have seen the file. What if someone had opened it? The sound of my screams, of a vase shattering, of Robert's whispered threats, echoing through the sterile halls of Harper and Sloan, my private horror, broadcast and cataloged on a corporate server. The thought was so terrifying I felt dizzy. I snatched my hand back as if the drive were red hot. I fumbled in my purse, found the correct, innocent-looking silver drive, and shakily printed my form. No one noticed a thing. Walking back to my desk, my legs felt like jelly. I sat down, my hands trembling. The close call was a brutal wake-up call. Hiding the evidence was not enough. Keeping it for myself, as some kind of secret weapon for a future confrontation, was a fool's game. It was too volatile, too easy to lose or expose by accident. The recording couldn't remain a private artifact of my suffering. It had to become a public record. It had to be deployed, not just kept. And it had to be done in a way that was unimpeachable. I couldn't just send it anonymously to the police. Robert was a respected local businessman. He would hire a lawyer who would paint me as a vindictive, unstable stepdaughter. They would claim the audio was edited, taken out of context. It would become a messy, he-said-she-said battle. No. The release had to be different. It had to be laundered through a system that gave it a veneer of legitimacy. My mind, trained in the logic of auditing, started to work. In my world, evidence requires a chain of custody. It needs context. It needs to be part of a formal process. An anonymous tip is gossip. But a finding in a formal audit, that's a fact that requires action. I didn't just want to get Robert arrested. I wanted to dismantle the entire facade. I wanted the people at his company, the neighbors who saw him as a pillar of the community, the friends who admired my mother's perfect life, to see the truth. I wanted to burn their world of pleasant fictions to the ground, just as he had threatened to do to mine. But how? How could I possibly inject a recording of domestic abuse into a corporate accounting audit? The idea was insane. It was impossible. And then, the opportunity arrived. It came, as so many things do in the corporate world, in the form of a bland, all-staff email from Human Resources. The subject line read, "Announcing our new employee safety and well-being initiative." I almost deleted it without reading. It was filled with the usual meaningless buzzwords, proactive, holistic, synergy, but then a phrase caught my eye. The company was launching a comprehensive safety audit, encouraging employees to confidentially report any concerns that might affect their performance or security, whether at work or at home. They were creating a secure, anonymous channel for submissions. I read the email 3 times. A slow smile spread across my face. It was perfect. It was a sanitized, corporate-approved Trojan horse. They were asking for safety concerns. I had one, and I had a piece of evidence that was about to find its official, documented, and utterly devastating context. Robert had punched a wall in a fit of rage. I was about to use a corporate memo to punch a hole right through the wall of his life. The first step of the plan required the precision of a surgeon and the anonymity of a ghost. During my lunch break, I didn't go to the sad little cafe in our building's lobby. Instead, I walked 6 blocks to the Waverly Public Library. It was a place of quiet, transient anonymity, smelling of old paper and dust. I sat down at a public computer terminal, the keyboard sticky from hundreds of unknown hands, and created a new email address. It was a string of meaningless numbers and letters from a disposable email service 7B3 Proton, me. It had no connection to my name, my work, or my life. It was a digital phantom. From this account, I composed my message to the Harper and Sloan Human Resources general inbox. The email was a masterpiece of detached corporate inquiry. I wrote it not as a victim, but as a concerned colleague, leveraging the language of their own recent initiative. Subject inquiry regarding employee safety and well-being initiative. To whom it may concern. In light of the company's commendable new safety audit initiative, a question of protocol has arisen. A colleague has expressed concern about a domestic situation that is impacting their well-being and, consequently, their ability to focus at work. This individual is in possession of sensitive audio documentation that substantiates their concerns. Before they consider coming forward, they wish to understand the firm's exact procedures for handling such evidence. What guarantees of confidentiality can be provided? What is the secure official channel for submitting such documentation for review by the appropriate personnel? Thank you for your guidance on this delicate matter. Regards, a concerned employee. I read it over a dozen times, tweaking a word here, adjusting the tone there. It was perfect. It was impersonal, professional, and put the onus entirely on them to provide a solution. It presented a problem not of a person, but of process. It was the kind of query an auditor would write. I hit send, logged out, and walked back to the office, my heart a steady, cold drum against my ribs. The reply came the next morning. It was exactly what I had hoped for. It was a form letter, written by an HR functionary named Brenda, filled with assurances of the company's commitment to employee privacy and safety. It referenced policy numbers and compliance standards, and at the bottom, it contained the key. For the secure submission of any sensitive audio or video files, please use the confidential HR digital Dropbox at the following link. Files are accessible only by the senior HR management team and our legal counsel. We assure you of our utmost discretion. The link was there. The gate was open. That night, after Robert's heavy whiskey-fueled snores began to reverberate through the house, I retrieved the USB from the flour canister. My hands were perfectly steady. I plugged it into my personal laptop. My movements swift and silent. I found the audio file, the raw recording of my own terror. I right-clicked on it. Rename. The new name was my Trojan horse. I typed it in carefully, each keystroke a deliberate act of sabotage. Doorbell footage, project audit, MP3. It was brilliantly, beautifully boring. Project audit was a term used 100 times a day at Harper & Sloan. Doorbell footage sounded like a dry piece of evidence from a corporate security review at a client's warehouse, not a home. The name was camouflage, designed to slip past a busy HR manager's initial scrutiny and land in a folder of mundane work files. I dragged the renamed file to my desktop, opened the link to the digital Dropbox, and uploaded it. The progress bar filled. The upload was complete. I closed my laptop. My face illuminated for a moment in the screen's dying light. The bomb had been planted. The next day at the office was an exercise in supreme self-control. I sat at my desk, immersed in the Northgate audit. My focus absolute. I built spreadsheets. I answered emails. I ran calculations. On the surface, I was the model employee Dana Cooper believed me to be. Inside, every nerve was alight. I was a walking, breathing countdown clock. The HR team's weekly management meeting was every Thursday at 10:00 a.m. They held it in Conference Room 7B, a glass-walled room directly across the hall from my cubicle. I could see their blurred outlines through the frosted glass. I couldn't hear their words, usually, but I knew the agenda. Brenda from HR had a habit of reviewing any new submissions from the Safety Initiative Dropbox at the top of the meeting. At 10:05 a.m., I saw the outlines settle around the long table. The muffled sound of pleasantries and coffee being poured reached me. I stared intently at a column of figures on my screen, but I wasn't seeing them. I was listening. The low murmur of conversation began, the familiar cadence of a routine meeting. My breathing was shallow. My palms were slick with sweat. Then, the murmuring stopped. A new sound began. Faint at first, bleeding through the glass wall. It was a voice, my mother's voice, tinny and distorted. Pretend she's busy. My blood turned to ice. It was happening. There was a pause. Then, the sound of Robert's slurred, angry voice, followed by the sickening, unmistakable crack of the vase shattering on the hardwood floor, even muffled. It was a sound of pure violence. Then came my own voice, a desperate, high-pitched plea. "Please, stop, I'm sorry." Then, the dull, percussive thud of Robert's fist hitting the wall, and finally, his voice, a venomous, sibilant whisper, clear enough even through the wall to be terrifying. "If you tell anyone, I will ruin you." An absolute, profound silence fell over Conference Room 7B. It was a heavy, shocked silence, a vacuum where the banal office chatter had been just moments before. The recording played on for another 10 seconds, just the sound of ragged, terrified breathing before someone abruptly cut it off. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single, sharp voice, it sounded like the head of HR, cut through the stillness, his words clear and panicked. What in God's name is this?" I kept my eyes glued to my monitor, my fingers resting on my keyboard as if I were about to type. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on the back of my head as the occupants of 7B filed out, not as a group, but one by one, their faces pale and stunned. They didn't speak. They scurried back to their desks like frightened mice. Within 15 minutes, the office grapevine was electric. The whispers started at the coffee machine and spread via instant messages and furtive glances over cubicle walls. The story changed with each telling, mutating into office legend. HR played a recording of a murder. It was one of the partners. Someone sent in a tape of their spouse being attacked. The details were wrong, but the essential truth was out, and it was spreading like a contagion. One of our own is being abused. There is proof, and the company has it. I remained an island of calm in the middle of the storm I had created. I completed my analysis of Northgate's cash-on-hand procedures. I submitted the report to Dana. I was methodical. I was focused. I was invisible. Later that afternoon, an IT technician visited the HR department. I watched from my desk as they checked workstations and network logs. They were searching for the phantom, 7B3T9X at Proton. Me. They would find nothing. The ghost had vanished. That evening, I went home. Robert was on the couch, watching a baseball game, a beer sweating onto the coaster beside him. He was in a good mood. His team was winning. "Hey," he grunted as I walked past. "Pick up some more of that fancy mustard you like tomorrow. We're almost out." He was completely, blissfully unaware. He had no idea that 60 miles away, in a downtown office building, the first cracks were appearing in the foundation of his life. He had no idea that a dozen strangers had listened to his soul laid bare, had heard the monster that lived behind the mask. He saw me as the same quiet, cowed stepdaughter he had seen that morning. He didn't see the architect of his ruin. He thought he was safe, but the fuse had been lit, and everything was just beginning to burn. The week that followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The office air, usually so placid and sterile, was now charged with a nervous, electric energy. The leaked audio had become a ghost haunting the 7th floor, an invisible presence in every conversation. There were no official memos, no all-staff meetings, just a thick, cloying silence from management that confirmed the rumors were true. People communicated in hushed tones by the coffee machine and through frantic, speculative instant messages. I became an object of intense, though indirect, scrutiny. As I walked the halls, conversations would halt, and I would feel eyes on my back. They were all trying to solve the mystery. Who was she? Which one of us carried a secret that was so violent, so raw? Every woman in the office was suddenly a suspect, evaluated for hidden bruises or a haunted look in her eyes. I, in turn, gave them nothing. I became a fortress of professionalism. I arrived early and stayed late, my focus on the Northgate audit unwavering. My work was impeccable, my reports meticulous. I was an island of calm, methodical productivity in an ocean of anxiety. This performance was, perhaps, the most demanding of my life. I had to project an aura of utter normalcy, while my insides were a knot of terror and anticipation. I was both the arsonist and the firefighter, calmly going about my duties while the building smoldered around me. I knew they were looking for a victim, someone visibly broken. I refused to fit their profile. I would not be defined by my trauma before I had the chance to define myself by my response to it. The summons came exactly 1 week after the leak, on a Thursday afternoon. It was an email, not from Brenda in HR, but from David Harrison himself, the Vice President of Human Resources. The subject line was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, confidential follow-up discussion. The body of the email was brief and formal, requesting my presence in the main boardroom at 4 o'clock to discuss a sensitive matter arising from the recent safety initiative. It was a summons, not an invitation. There was no option to decline. I read the email, and a profound, chilling calm settled over me. The waiting was over. The countdown had reached 0. I replied with a single word, confirmed. Then I went back to my spreadsheet, my hands perfectly steady. At precisely 3:58 p.m., I saved my work, logged out of my computer, and stood up. The walk from my cubicle to the boardroom felt 100 miles long. The usual office sounds the clicking of keyboards. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into a dull roar. Each step was deliberate. This was not the walk of a victim being led to an interrogation. This was the walk of a strategist arriving to observe the results of her gambit. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The boardroom was large and intimidating, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The room was unnervously bright, every surface gleaming, leaving no room for shadows. 3 people were waiting for me. David Harrison sat at the head of the table, his face a grim, unreadable mask. To his right was Brenda, the lower-level HR manager, who refused to meet my eyes, focusing instead on shuffling a stack of papers. To his left was a sharp-featured woman in a severe gray suit I didn't recognize. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression clinical. She had to be the company's lawyer. A single chair had been placed for me, not as part of the main group, but slightly separated, facing them. It was a clear, deliberate staging. This was not a conversation among colleagues. This was an inquisition. "Caroline, thank you for coming," David Harrison began, his voice devoid of its usual forced warmth. "This is Catherine Vale from our legal counsel." I nodded at her. She did not nod back. "As you know," he continued, "the firm takes employee well-being very seriously. An anonymous submission was made to our confidential portal last week, a piece of audio. Given your role in the internal audit department and your exemplary record for discretion, we wanted to consult with you. It was a lie, a thin pretext to get me in the room, but I played along, of course. How can I help?" "We're going to play the audio file for you," Harrison said, gesturing to a small speaker on the table. "We understand it is highly disturbing. We simply need to know if you recognize anything, the location, the voices, anything at all that might help us identify the employee who is clearly in a dangerous situation." The lawyer, Catherine Vale, leaned forward slightly. "Everything said in this room, Ms. Miller, is strictly confidential." I gave a single, sharp nod. "I understand." Harrison clicked a button on his laptop. The recording began. The sound filled the sterile boardroom, an obscene intrusion of raw, chaotic violence into this temple of corporate order. First, my mother's voice, light and treacherous. "Pretend she's busy." I watched their faces. Harrison flinched. Brenda squeezed her eyes shut. The lawyer remained impassive, her gaze fixed on me, analyzing my reaction. Then came the rest of it, the ugly, slurred words from Robert, the crash of the vase, which made Brenda jump in her seat, my own desperate, pleading cries. It was profoundly bizarre to sit there, a silent observer in a suit, listening to a recording of myself at my most broken and terrified. I focused on my breathing, keeping it slow and even. I placed my hands flat on the table in front of me, forcing them to be still. I would not tremble. I would not weep. I would not give them the emotional display they were likely expecting. The recording ended with Robert's final, whispered threat. Harrison clicked it off. and the silence that rushed back in was somehow louder and more terrible than the noise had been. He cleared his throat, his professional composure clearly shaken. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and corporate liability. "So, Caroline," he said, his voice strained. "As we said, it's a long shot. But do you have any knowledge of the individuals in this recording? Do you recognize anyone?" This was the moment, the culmination of all the years of silence, all the planning, all the rage I had swallowed and converted into fuel. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit with the ugliness of what they had just heard. I looked at David Harrison. I looked at Brenda. Finally, I looked at the lawyer, Catherine Vale, and I held her analytical gaze. My voice, when I finally spoke, was quiet, clear, and steady. It did not shake. "Yes," I said, "I do." I paused, letting the word hang in the air. "The man you heard is my stepfather, Robert Hale. The woman who spoke at the beginning is my mother, Eleanor, and the person, the one you heard crying." I took a steadying breath. "That's me." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if I had detonated a stun grenade in the center of the room. David Harrison's jaw literally dropped. Brenda let out a small, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Even the lawyer's icy composure finally cracked. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her mask of professional detachment shattering. The carefully constructed wall between their orderly corporate world and my messy, violent home life had just been utterly demolished. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, filled with shock and the dawning horror of comprehension. They weren't just listening to a hypothetical employee's problem anymore. The problem was sitting right in front of them. The ghost from the audio file had a name, and she worked in their internal audit department. Catherine Vale was the first to recover. Her legal training kicked in, pushing past the initial shock. "Ms. Miller, Caroline," she said, her voice now softer, more cautious. "Are you in a safe place now? Are you in immediate danger?" "I am not in immediate danger," I said calmly, "but the situation is untenable." "We are obligated to report this," she stated, looking at Harrison, who just nodded dumbly. "Assault? Threats? This is a criminal matter. Are you willing to speak with the police?" "Yes," I said without hesitation, "and I have the original, time-stamped file on a USB drive. I can provide it to them as evidence." That sealed it. This wasn't just a story. It was a prosecutable case. Harrison made the call. 20 minutes later, 2 plainclothes detectives from the Waverly Police Department were standing in the boardroom doorway. The transition from a corporate HR issue to a criminal investigation was swift and seamless. I gave my statement in a calm, factual monologue. I described the events, the history, the fear. Then, I handed Detective Miller a strange coincidence of names, the small, black USB drive I had brought with me. He placed it in a sealed evidence bag. The process was sterile, procedural, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. They escorted me to my car. I drove home in a daze, the world outside my windshield seeming blurry and unreal. I was halfway home when my phone shrieked. It was my mother. I answered, putting the phone on speaker. Her voice was a torrent of panicked rage. "Caroline, what have you done?" "The police. They were at Robert's office. They took him in for questioning." "Are you insane? He has lawyers, the best lawyers in the state. They will tear you apart." I listened to her tirade, to the fear and fury that was all about protecting him, protecting her gilded cage. The storm was finally breaking, just as I had planned. I was no longer afraid of the thunder. I waited for her to run out of breath, and then I spoke, my voice colder and calmer than I had ever heard it. And I said, "Have the truth." The police station was a universe of beige walls, beige linoleum floors, beige metal desks. It smelled of burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and a faint, underlying metallic tang of fear. The world here was stripped of all sentiment. It was a place for facts, for statements, for the methodical documentation of human ugliness. After the hushed, carpeted crisis of the boardroom, the stark reality of this place felt like a splash of cold water. It was exactly what I needed. I sat across from two detectives in a small, windowless room. The air was still and close. The lead detective, Miller, the one who shared my last name, was a man in his 50s with tired eyes that had seen too many stories like mine. His partner, a younger woman named Detective Sandoval, had a sharp, intelligent gaze that missed nothing. There was no pity in their expressions, only a quiet, professional focus. "Okay, Ms. Miller," Detective Miller began, clicking his pen. "I need you to walk me through it. From the beginning, every detail you can remember, no matter how small." And so I did. I didn't tell it like a story. I presented it like an audit report. I gave them dates, times, specific phrases. I described the escalating tension, the subtle shifts in Robert's demeanor, the way my mother learned to look away. I spoke in a low, even monotone, my voice betraying no emotion. I was a narrator, not a protagonist. I was simply presenting the data. Sandoval took notes, her pen scratching across a legal pad, the only sound in the room besides my voice. When I finished, Miller nodded slowly. "And you have the audio from the night of the incident?" "Yes," I said, "on the drive I gave you." He nodded to Sandoval. She left the room and returned a moment later with a laptop. She plugged in the evidence bag containing my USB drive, handling it with practiced care. Miller turned the laptop so I could see the screen. "This is the file," he asked, pointing to Doorbell Footage Project Audit, MP3. "Yes." He clicked play. The sound was shockingly loud in the small, quiet room. My mother's voice filled the space first, a ghost of suburban treachery. "Pretend she's busy." I watched Miller's jaw tighten. Then, the rest of it, the ugly, chaotic symphony of that night, the slurred insults, the crash of the vase, my own voice, thin and terrified. "Please stop." The thud of the punch against the wall. Sandoval closed her eyes for a second, a flicker of empathy breaking through her professional mask, and finally, Robert's voice. The words, "A cold, clear poison. If you tell anyone, I will ruin you." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Miller let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Sandoval, then at me. "Well," he said, his voice a low grumble, "there's not a lot of ambiguity there. That's clear evidence of assault and terroristic threatening." It was at that moment that the door opened. A uniformed officer leaned in. "Detective Mr. Hale and his lawyer are here." Robert strode into the station like he owned it. He was wearing a golf shirt and an expression of outraged indignation. Flanking him was a man in a $1,000 suit with a face like a clenched fist. This had to be one of the best lawyers in the state. They were shown into a different interview room, but the walls were thin. We waited. The minutes ticked by. Then, Miller and Sandoval were called out. They were gone for a long time. When they returned, Miller's expression was hard as stone. "His story is quite different," he said, sitting down heavily. "He claims you've always hated him, that you're a disturbed, vindictive young woman angry that he replaced your father." He looked down at his notes. "He says you doctored the audio, spliced together different conversations to create a false narrative. His lawyer is claiming it's a malicious fabrication." I felt a cold smile touch my lips, but I suppressed it. "Of course, he does," I said. "His lawyer is good," Sandoval added. Her arms crossed. "He's already demanding the audio be submitted for forensic analysis, claiming it will prove it's been tampered with. He's turning this into a battle of experts." "It's a powerful recording," Miller said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But a smart lawyer can create doubt. He can muddy the waters, make a jury wonder." I leaned forward slightly. I held their gaze. "He's right about one thing," I said softly. "It's not just an audio recording." Miller frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's from a Nest doorbell camera," I explained. "It records video, too. The file on the drive is an MP4. You've only been listening to the audio track." A flash of understanding, then excitement, lit up Sandoval's eyes. Miller sat up straighter. It recorded video of the assault. Not directly, I said, managing their expectations. The camera faces the front door. The incident happened in the entryway, just inside the door. Out of the camera's direct line of sight, you can't see the actual physical contact. I paused, letting the information sink in before delivering the critical detail. But you can see him. The camera's wide-angle lens captures the living room in the background. And when he turns to punch the wall, he steps directly into the frame. The light from the kitchen hits his face. You can see his expression. You can see the rage. Miller and Sandoval exchanged a look, without a word. Sandoval turned the laptop around, opened the file with a video player, and rewound it. She hit play. The video was grainy, the colors washed out by the artificial light. For the first part, it was just a static shot of our empty entryway, but we could hear everything. Then, a shape moved in the background. Robert. He moved into the entryway, just off screen. We heard the crash, heard my pleas. Then, he stormed back into the frame. His face, for a split second, filled the screen. It wasn't the face of the charming businessman. It was a grotesque mask of pure, uncontrolled fury. His teeth were bared, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his features twisted into a snarl. We saw his body tense, his arm draw back. He moved just out of frame, and we heard the thud. Then he stepped back into view to deliver his whispered threat. It was irrefutable. It was the monster, caught on camera. A knock on the door interrupted the silence. It was my mother. She had been called down to the station, and she looked small and broken. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and puffy. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the detectives, her expression a mess of fear and desperate pleading. They brought Robert and his lawyer into the room with us. The lawyer immediately started protesting, but Miller held up a hand. "Just watch, counselor." He replayed the video. This time, he didn't stop it. We all watched. Robert's face appeared on the screen. A monster in a polo shirt. I saw Robert's real face flinch. The color drained from his skin. The arrogant bluster evaporated, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man seeing his true self for the first time. The lawyer stared at the screen, his mouth a thin, hard line. His case, his entire strategy of denial and fabrication, had just disintegrated in high-definition video. When the video ended, Robert Hale finally fell silent. My mother, however, did not. She started to sob, not quiet tears, but wrenching, theatrical sobs of despair. She turned, not to me, but to Robert. "He didn't mean it," she cried, her voice cracking. She looked at the detectives, her eyes begging for an absolution they could not provide. "He just has a temper. He was under a lot of stress from work. He just lost his temper for a minute." She was still protecting him, still making excuses, still choosing the illusion over the reality, even when the reality was playing on a loop on a laptop screen 2 feet in front of her. The last, brittle thread of connection I felt to her snapped. All the years of pain, of swallowed anger, of forced silence, coalesced into a single moment of ice-cold clarity. I looked directly at her, my voice quiet, cutting through her sobs. "He lost his temper." I let the words hang in the air for a beat. "And you, Mom," I said, my voice utterly devoid of heat or emotion. "You lost your conscience." She stared at me, her mouth open, the tears stopping as if a switch had been flipped. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. In my voice, she finally heard not a child to be managed, but a judge delivering a verdict. Detective Miller cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He looked at Robert's lawyer. "I believe we have sufficient evidence to formally charge your client," he said, his voice firm. "The district attorney will be in touch." The process was over. The gears of the legal system were now in motion, grinding forward with a momentum of their own. Robert was led away, no longer swaggering, looking pale and shrunken. His lawyer followed, his face grim. My mother just stood there, lost and alone in the center of the beige room. I stood up and walked out. I didn't look back at her. I walked through the station, past the ringing phones and the preoccupied officers, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The late afternoon sun was bright, and I didn't flinch. The air was cool and clean. I walked down the steps to the sidewalk, and I did not cry. There was no need. Crying is for when you've lost something. I hadn't lost a thing. I had just taken my life back. In a small town like Waverly. Secrets have a short shelf life. The news didn't break like a tidal wave. It seeped into the community like groundwater. It started with a 2-sentence blurb in the online edition of the Waverly Gazette. Tucked away in the police blotter section, local businessman Robert Hale, 54, was charged with assault and menacing following a domestic dispute. He was released on his own recognizance pending a court date. It was dry, factual, and utterly devastating. That single paragraph was the spark. Within an hour, it was being shared on the town's main Facebook group, Waverly Community Watch. The comment section was a predictable mix of shock, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. Robert Hale. The guy from the Rotary Club. There have to be two sides to every story. Thoughts and prayers for the family. It was a digital pantomime of concern, a performance for their neighbors. But then, someone poured gasoline on the spark. The audio file, edited to include the most damning 30 seconds, appeared online. No one knew where it came from. My guess was a low-level HR employee at Harper & Sloan. Someone with a conscience and a burner email account who sent it to a local blogger. It didn't matter. Once it was out, it was everywhere. The internet, in its immoral and chaotic way, did not treat it as a solemn piece of evidence. It treated it as content. The phrase my mother had used to sign my social death warrant became a meme. Pretend she's busy was suddenly a viral sound on TikTok. Teenagers used it over videos of themselves ignoring their chores. It was tweeted ironically by influencers complaining about their brand deals. It became a darkly comedic shorthand for complicity and feigned ignorance. My mother's casual, cruel whisper was now a punchline, stripped of its context and replayed for millions. A digital ghost haunting the airwaves. My trauma had become entertainment. For my mother, the digital storm was a direct hit. Her carefully curated Facebook profile, a gallery of smiling vacation photos and cheerful updates about her garden, became a war zone. Strangers flooded her comments with links to the audio, with snake emojis, with accusations that were brutally, unforgivably true. She was a collaborator, a monster, a woman who sold her own daughter for a comfortable life. Within 24 hours, her profile was deactivated. Her Instagram went private. She pulled up the digital drawbridge, but it was too late. The siege had already moved offline. The neighbors were the first to turn. Mrs. Gable from across the street, who used to wave enthusiastically every morning, now found something fascinating about the pavement whenever my mother's car pulled out of the driveway. The mailman, who used to chat with her about the weather, now just shoved the letters in the box and scurried away. A trip to the grocery store became an exercise in public humiliation. Other shoppers would steer their carts to other aisles. The checkout girl would scan her items in a stony, accusatory silence. Waverly had passed its judgment. My mother, who had spent years obsessing over appearances, had become a social leper. The community she had tried so desperately to impress had excommunicated her. Robert's downfall was less social and more catastrophic. It was brutally corporate. His logistics firm, where his name was on the letterhead, moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a company trying to cauterize a wound. A junior partner, a man Robert had mentored, released a public statement. It was a masterclass in legal jargon and reputation management. It spoke of deeply disturbing allegations, of taking these matters with the utmost seriousness, and announced that Mr. Hale was taking an indefinite leave of absence to focus on his personal matters. It was a corporate execution. The financial hemorrhaging began almost immediately. His largest client, a regional supermarket chain, invoked a morals clause in their contract and pulled their business. A half-dozen smaller clients followed suit. The man who defined his entire worth by his net worth, by the deals he closed, and the respect he commanded, was being systematically dismantled. The reputation he had spent a lifetime building was annihilated in less than a week by a 30-second audio clip. And me, I became an unwilling local celebrity. I was the stepdaughter. People I barely knew from high school sent me long, effusive messages on social media, praising my courage. Dana Cooper called me into her office, closed the door, and told me the firm stood behind me and to take all the time I needed. Her voice laced with an uncharacteristic, awkward sincerity. My colleagues would give me small, sad, encouraging smiles in the hallway. I was brave. I was a survivor. I was an inspiration. I felt none of it. I felt hollow. The storm of public opinion, both for and against my family, was just noise. It was a distant weather report about a hurricane happening on another continent. The validation felt meaningless. I hadn't done it to be brave. I had done it to stop being afraid. The goal wasn't to win public approval. It was to end a private war. The aftermath was just an echo. Then, one evening, as I was scrolling numbly through the dozens of unread messages from well-meaning strangers, one caught my eye. The profile picture was a generic gray avatar. The name was unfamiliar. The message was short. The words typed with a hesitant, trembling energy. I know this is going to sound crazy, and you don't know me. My name is Sarah. I saw the news about Robert Hale. I used to work for him. About 5 years ago. I thought you should know. You're not the first. And I have a recording, too. My blood ran cold. I read the message again and again. I typed back a single, shaky question that a recording of what? Her reply came almost instantly, of him, on a voicemail. He left me a message after I quit. It's a lot like the one you have. He's threatening me, to ruin my life. I was too scared to do anything with it then. But hearing your story, maybe I can now. I gave her Detective Miller's name and number. That message changed everything. My case was no longer an isolated, he said. She said domestic dispute. It was now potentially a pattern. Sarah's voicemail, saved for 5 years on an old phone, was a piece of history, a second data point that suggested not a momentary loss of temper, but a practiced methodology of intimidation and control. The police reopened an old file on a harassment complaint filed by a former employee, Sarah, that had been dismissed for lack of evidence. The court date for Robert's bail hearing arrived. It was no longer a formality. With the new evidence from a second victim, the district attorney argued that Robert was not just a man who had a bad night, but a potential ongoing threat to the community. They argued he was a flight risk, that his financial world was collapsing, and he had nothing left to lose. My mother was there, sitting in the front row, looking elegant and fragile in a black dress, a grieving widow at the funeral of her own life. She had a cashier's check in her purse for the bail, a final, desperate act of loyalty to the man who had provided for her, the man who had destroyed us. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had clearly read the updated file, was not moved by my mother's performance. She listened to the DA's arguments. She listened to Robert's lawyer's weak rebuttals. Then she delivered her ruling, her voice cold and final. Given the new evidence suggesting a pattern of threatening behavior, she announced, looking down at Robert, "This court finds that the defendant constitutes a potential danger to his accusers and the community at large. Bail is denied. The defendant will be remanded in custody until the trial date." A gasp echoed through the courtroom. It was my mother. The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. Robert, his face pale and slack with shock, was led away by the bailiffs. He was no longer a powerful man in a golf shirt. He was just an inmate in the county jail. My mother sat frozen on the bench, the useless cashier's check still in her purse. The security she had traded my soul for had just been revoked. Her provider was gone, the house, the car, the credit cards, the entire architecture of her life was about to collapse. For the first time since my father walked out the door 23 years ago, she was completely, utterly on her own. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was just a place of quiet. The silence was different now, stripped of its menace. It was no longer the heavy, watchful silence that preceded a storm, but the thin, hollow silence of an empty vessel. The air itself felt lighter, as if the sheer mass of Robert's presence, his anger and resentment, had been a physical weight that had now been lifted. For the first time in years, I could breathe in my own home. I sat in the living room, in the dark, with only a single, weak lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on the walls. I was staring at his chair, the big, ugly leather recliner he had always occupied, the throne from which he ruled his tiny, miserable kingdom. It was empty, the leather was worn and cracked, and there was a faint indentation where his body had spent countless hours, a ghost of his oppressive weight. For so long, that chair had been the gravitational center of the house, an object of dread. Now, it was just a piece of furniture, ugly and old and powerless. The house was mine now, in a way it never had been before. My mother had packed a bag the day Robert's bail was denied and had gone to stay with her sister across town, unable to bear the shame or the emptiness. She left without a word to me, just a collection of half-empty perfume bottles on her dresser and the lingering scent of her defeat. So I sat in the silent house, the sole occupant, a custodian of the crime scene. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, a harsh, intrusive sound in the stillness. It was a text from my mother. I had been expecting it. It was her final, desperate salvo. "The trial starts tomorrow. If you get on that stand and testify, you will destroy this family for good." I stared at the words on the screen. This family. She still clung to that word, that fiction, as if it were a life raft. She spoke of its destruction as a future event, something I had the power to prevent, as if there was anything left to save. The anger that rose in me was cold and tired. It was the anger of pure exhaustion. I typed my reply, my thumbs moving with a slow, deliberate precision. "The family was destroyed a long time ago. Mom, you just haven't been willing to sign the death certificate." I hit send. She didn't reply. What was there to say? The truth, once spoken, has a weight all its own. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, and let the memories come. They weren't the violent, crashing memories of that last night. They were the quieter, more insidious ones, the memories of complicity. I was 12, and I had a dark, ugly bruise on my arm from where Robert had grabbed me to pull me out of his way. My mother saw it as I was getting ready for school. She didn't ask what happened. She simply went to her makeup drawer, pulled out a tube of thick, pasty concealer, and dabbed it carefully over the bruise. "There," she had said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "We don't want to make a scene, do we?" I was 17, and Robert, in a drunken fit of pique, because I had been accepted to a better college than he had attended, had accidentally knocked my laptop off my desk, shattering the screen. It was 2 weeks before my final exams. My mother had taken me aside, her eyes pleading. "He didn't mean it. Caroline, he's just proud of you. He doesn't know how to show it. Let's not make him feel bad. I'll buy you a new one. Let's just not make a fuss. Don't make a scene. Don't make a fuss. Endure it. Pretend." Her entire philosophy of survival had been to smooth over the cracks, to paint over the rot, to insist that the crumbling facade was a solid wall. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the architect of our silence. She had taught me that my pain was an inconvenience, my fear an embarrassment, and for so long, I had believed her. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I put on my headphones, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I needed to hear it one more time. I opened the file and clicked play. The recording was different now. The first time I had listened, it was with a sense of terrified validation. Now, I listened with a kind of clinical detachment, an auditor reviewing a piece of evidence. I heard my mother's voice, the sound of her betrayal. I heard Robert's voice, the raw, ugly sound of his rage. And then, I heard my own. It was the voice of a stranger. It was small, and thin, and desperately high-pitched. It was a voice that was pleading, begging, trying to appease the monster in front of it. "Please stop. I'm sorry." I listened to that voice, the voice of the girl I used to be, and I felt a profound, aching sorrow for her. I listened as her pleas became weaker, as they dissolved into ragged, terrified sobs, and then, finally, as they faded into nothing but the sound of her breathing, a shallow, desperate fight for air. She had been silenced. And in that moment, listening to the ghost of my own voice, something inside me shifted. A final, tectonic plate locking into place. I finally understood what I had to do. And why. The evidence, the recording, the video. They were powerful. They were the key to his conviction. But they weren't enough. If all I did was hand over the USB drive and let the lawyers play the tape, then I would forever be the girl on that recording. I would be the silent, crying victim whose story was told by a piece of technology. My most defining moment would be a sound file. A victim with proof is still just a victim. I didn't want to be a victim anymore. I didn't want my story to be told by a recording of my own silence. I wanted to be the one who spoke. I wanted to stand in that courtroom, in that witness box, and use my own voice, the one that I had found in the wreckage of my life. I wanted Robert to see me, not as a cowering girl, but as the woman who was about to finish him. I wanted my mother to hear my voice, not pleading for mercy, but delivering a judgment. I needed to be the one to end this, not the tape, me. I closed the audio file. I would not listen to it again. I opened a new email. It was addressed to the assistant district attorney who was prosecuting the case. The subject line was simple: regarding my testimony tomorrow in the case of the People versus Robert Hale. The body of the email was even simpler. I typed the words, each one a declaration of war, each one a reclamation of the voice that had been stolen from me. Tomorrow on the stand, I will not be just confirming the evidence you have. I will be telling them everything. I hit send. It was done. There was no going back. A profound sense of peace washed over me, a quiet that was deeper and more real than the silence of the empty house. I went upstairs to my room and lay down in my bed. I didn't expect to sleep, but my body felt light, my mind clear. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the old house settle and groan around me. For my entire life, the silence of the night in this house had been a source of anxiety, a canvas onto which I projected my fears. But tonight, it was just silence. It held no threat. It held no power. The fear was finally, truly gone, because fear thrives on the unspoken, on the secrets that fester in the dark. It feeds on the lies we tell ourselves and the lies we allow others to tell. But now, there were no more secrets. There were no more lies. Everything that had been hidden was about to be brought into the light. Every lie had been recorded, and tomorrow, I would press play. The witness stand was a lonely, elevated island in a sea of polished wood and hushed tension. From here, I could see everything: the 12 faces of the jury, a mosaic of curiosity, boredom, and carefully practiced neutrality. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman who now looked at me with a kind of awed respect. Robert, sitting beside his expensive lawyer, looking smaller and paler than I had ever seen him, his usual bluster replaced by a waxy, sweaty sheen of fear. And my mother, seated in the front row of the gallery, a statue of tragic motherhood, her hands clutching a purse in her lap like a shield. She had not looked at me once. I had spent the morning answering the prosecutor's questions. My voice was a steady, low monotone, the voice I used at work when presenting an audit. I laid out the facts of my life in that house, not with emotion, but with the cold precision of a ledger. I spoke of the atmosphere of control, the subtle threats, the slow, methodical erosion of my identity. I was not asking for sympathy. I was establishing a pattern of behavior, providing the necessary context for the exhibit that was to come. Robert's lawyer had tried to rattle me on cross-examination, painting me as a bitter, jealous stepdaughter. I simply answered his questions with the same flat, emotionless calm. He couldn't find a crack in the facade because there wasn't one. I wasn't performing. I was reporting. The prosecution would now like to present Exhibit A, the prosecutor announced, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. the audio and video file recovered from the defendant's home security system. A technician wheeled a large television screen to the front of the jury box. The courtroom lights were dimmed slightly, and a palpable shift occurred in the room. The air grew still, charged with anticipation. This was no longer about testimony or legal arguments. This was the main event. This was the truth, unfiltered and undeniable. The technician hit a key, and the screen flickered to life. It showed the static, empty view of our entryway. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a sound filled the courtroom, amplified and unnaturally clear. It was my mother's voice. "Pretend she's busy." The words, so casual and light in their original delivery, were monstrous in this context. They hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline artifact of her betrayal. I watched the jury. A woman in the front row frowned, her head tilting. A man in the back leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. I risked a glance at my mother. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking. But she wasn't crying. She was just shrinking, trying to disappear, to pretend she wasn't there. Then came the other sounds, a chaotic symphony of violence that desecrated the courtroom's solemnity. Robert's slurred, angry voice, my own, a thin, desperate plea. Then the sound of the vase shattering, a percussive crack that made two of the jurors physically flinch. The sound was obscene in this quiet, orderly space. It was the sound of a world breaking. Then, the image on the screen changed. Robert, my stepfather, stormed into the frame. His face, projected 6 feet high, was a grotesque mask of rage. His features were twisted, his eyes bulging. The jury was no longer just listening. They were watching. They saw the man who sat just a few feet away from them, in a neatly pressed suit, transform into a monster. They saw his body tense, saw his arm draw back before he moved just out of frame. They heard the dull, sickening thud of his fist striking the wall. He stepped back into the frame, his face inches from the camera's lens, and his voice, a low, venomous whisper, hissed from the speakers, coiling its way into every corner of the room. "If you tell anyone, I will ruin you." The video file ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and damning. It was the silence of a truth so complete that there was nothing left to say. The judge, a woman with a reputation for no-nonsense severity, broke the stillness. She did not look at the lawyers or the jury. She looked directly at Robert Hale, her eyes cold as steel. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "Nothing to pretend anymore, Miss Hale." It was over. The lawyer's face was slack, his meticulously prepared defense reduced to ashes. Robert stared at the blank screen, his mouth slightly open, as if he had just witnessed his own execution. The bailiffs moved in, their footsteps heavy and certain. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Robert's wrists was the final sound of his old life ending. He didn't resist. He just bowed his head, a broken man, and allowed them to lead him away. As they passed the gallery, I finally stood up from the witness stand. My legs were a little shaky, but I walked with a steady, deliberate pace. I had to pass the front row where my mother sat. She had her head in her hands now, finally allowing herself the performance of a sob. As I drew level with her, she looked up, her eyes red and pleading, searching my face for what forgiveness absolution? An escape from the consequences of her choices. She opened her mouth to speak, my name forming on her lips. I didn't give her the chance. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not even sadness. Just a vast, cold emptiness where a daughter's love used to be. I leaned in slightly, my voice a quiet whisper meant only for her, a perfect, final echo of her own betrayal. "I'm busy now, Mom." I walked away without looking back. I didn't need to see her reaction. I pushed through the swinging doors at the back of the courtroom. They closed behind me with a heavy, final thud, the sound reverberating down the empty marble hallway. That part of my life was over. The door was closed. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the cool, crisp autumn air. The wind felt clean on my face, washing away the stale, recycled air of the courtroom. The sun was bright, and I had to squint as my eyes adjusted. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. A car horn blared in the distance. A flock of pigeons took flight from the courthouse steps. It was all just normal. Life was going on. As I took my first step toward my new, unwritten future, the heavy courthouse door opened and closed behind me, letting someone else out into the light. It swung shut with a soft chime from the small bell mounted above it, a gentle, melodic sound to announce a visitor's arrival or departure. The sound was so familiar. It was the sound of a notification, the sound of a camera, watching. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of joy or triumph. It was a smile of quiet, absolute finality. I stopped on the steps, the wind whipping a strand of hair across my face, and I whispered the words to myself, a final, fitting epitaph for the life I was leaving behind. The doorbell caught everything. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help it get heard by more people. Your support means the world.